it's the kind of thing that can keep a man awake all night long. These kinds of misconceptions about politics and economics and why we're all in the straits we're in. I'm not here to call anybody out. I'm not looking for a fight, but the endurance of these ideas, I want you to take a look at this fight of Tim Pool's show tonight. I don't know who the man is who's on with him. I've been working to set this whole thing up. Didn't get that. I should have taken that note, but I didn't. We're going to discuss capitalism and economics and the political compass test that's half a century old now and has been wrought into all kinds of things. This is an example of what's going on with it. Take a look at this. This is Tim, right? He's going to be taking super chats from his audience.
Running around is a liberal fantasy. I agree. Omega Resetsu says, Tim, I cringe every time you say economic right and left. Economics falls in the authoritarian libertarian axis, not left right, bottom up versus top down. Completely wrong. You are wrong, sir. Wrong. So on the libertarian spectrum, you can have anarcho-communist and anarcho-capitalist. And people who don't understand the spectrum might say, like, how can communists be anarchists? 7 people living on a farm who don't use money for any exchange and have an expectation amongst each other as a community on what work is to be done and how. So it's quite literally someone's like, hey, I grew some squash. Would you like to share it with me? I'm going to give my squash to you. And then the other hippie goes, and I did the dishes so that we can have clean plates when we eat our squash.
We're going to pause now and then. Now, look, this is all well and good. They have an expectation. That's the word he used, and it's a reasonable expectation because they've all agreed to it. We're going to carry on.
That's not capital. That is communal labor.
This is a misconception of capital right away. I don't know where it comes from in its origins. Capital is the accumulation of human productivity in material form. That's what capital is. So anything like what he's talking about that brings anything more than human labor to the deal is capital. How do you accumulate this? Well, it's been said that production is the application of reason to the problem of survival, which is what he's describing on this farm commune here. Keep going with this for a minute.
Works really, really well for small groups and tribes. Does not scale.
Now, we've hit on one of the cores of the misconception here. He's going to be discussing scale, but you see, that's not the essential attribute of the human social organization. These human social organizations are arranged according to certain principles. Scale is not the essence of this particular social organization, what he's calling a commune or communism. It'll evolve to that concept here soon enough. That's not the essence of the matter, scale. Listen to this.
Then you move to the right and you get laissez-faire capitalism, where the guy walks up to the other guy and says, I got squash. If you want it, it's $1 a piece.
Now, again, let's just bear in mind that we're referring to this. Okay, this is this political compass thing where economic left is what he's talking about when he refers to communal living. It's an economic essential that's being judged here. That's the criterion of the judgment is economics. And he's now been pointing out that as you move to the right on this scale, the economic right, you run into more capitalism. Let's go back to what he was saying over here.
That dollar is a universal trade medium that I use. Then they can reinvest that dollar into, hiring someone, help them grow more squash, et cetera, et cetera. In the communal side, if you start going towards the authoritarian spectrum, you get Stalin, where he walks up to you, puts a gun in your mouth, and says, you are giving me your squash because we're going to share it with everybody.
That's, again, referring to this political compass thing, okay? It scales up, and authoritarianism up and down, libertarianism is all very convenient for arranging people's political labels according to the essentials that Tim is laying out here. And it's not just him. This has been common for a long, long time. Authoritarians are at the top of the scale, libertarians are at the bottom of the scale, and this is all scaled according to economics. Back to Tim here.
Now, strangely, how it works with the authoritarian right doesn't quite make sense because they don't necessarily have capitalist systems, but there is still an argument to be made for what we associate with the authoritarian right being ultra-traditionalist. And then, to your point, there is a confliction between what we would determine to be the authoritarian right. It's the odd group out in the entirety of the political compass. However, it's typically because Nazis did use capital systems. They were, quote unquote, socialists, but they used capital exchange.
Now, you can begin to hear the waffling in this, and he's going to point out later on that this is a cursory look at this, and he's right. Okay, it's not very deep. And naturally, he doesn't have time to go into all of that when he's dealing with super chats at the end of his program. You know, this is a much deeper discussion than that. However, he talks about the Nazis using capital, and you remember what I just said a moment ago about capital being the accumulation of human labor in material form. Essentially, what it is. It can be built up conceptually with, for instance, investments, you know, in growing companies, things like that, growing businesses, and interest on loans. Okay, these are concepts, but they work off the same basic foundation of human labor in material form. So Tim is talking about the Nazis using capital. Well, that's what they did. They didn't accumulate it. They didn't produce it. They stole it, which is what they have in common with the Soviets. They did the same thing. Yeah.
Kind of like the Chinese communists do.
Right.
There's a lot to go through, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's a simple version.
He's right about this.
Well, basically, what you're describing with the Nazis...
Pause. I don't know who this gentleman is. I didn't get the introduction notes when I set this up. Let's listen to him for a moment.
It was corporatism, and that's what we have today.
Right.
It's kind of the best of both worlds between communism and capitalism, where you still have some semblance of private ownership. You still have a price system, and the price system is probably the most...
I'd like to pause right there. Some semblance of private ownership. Now, let's go through that concept in some detail. And you know something, I happen to have this noted. I was looking at this recently. This is Ludwig von Mises' Socialism, written in 1922. This is the 87, I believe, Liberty Classics edition. Da-ba-doo-ba-doo-da, woo. Da-da-blah. 1981, all right? I have this noted in two places right here on page 27, chapter 1. It states flatly in one sentence of about 10 words. Ready? Here we go. You can see it right here. I noted this a long time ago. Boom, there it is. All right. And my other bookmarkers just fell out. But Mises states at the very top of Socialism, chapter 1, first paragraph, an owner is he who disposes of an economic good. Let's keep that in mind. Now, that other bookmark just fell out. I believe it was page 49. Yes, here it is. All right, and this heavily annotated page, it's in the first paragraph, okay? Ownership is power of disposal. Now, keep that in mind. What does disposal mean? That means complete control over an economic good, absolute power to do what one wants with what one owns. It can't be put any plainer than that. This is nearly axiomatic. There are not very many concepts, constituent concepts in this to analyze. Does everyone understand the power of disposal? This is Mises right here in the front of the book. So it makes no sense, if we understand that principle, to be discussing things like...
It's a simple version. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, basically, what you're describing what the Nazis did was corporatism, and that's what we have today.
Right.
It's kind of the best of both worlds between communism and capitalism, where you still have some semblance of private ownership. You still...
It doesn't make any sense to discuss things like some semblance of private ownership into the discussion, because it was the Nazis who ultimately controlled the disposal of property. Now, everyone knows this who's taken even a cursory glance at the Nazis. Let's listen to this gentleman a little bit more here.
Have a price system, and the price system is probably the most important.
But that's not communism then, it's just authoritarianism.
Right.
Now, okay, wait a minute. See, now, what isn't entering into Tim's thinking that I can see is that the difference between what he described earlier as the hippie communes and what we're describing now is the element of force. You see, the hippies could walk away from their communes. You didn't get to walk away from the Nazis. That was kind of the point. And the point began earlier and ran out a hell of a lot longer with the Soviets. The difference is the element of force in the social relationship. That's what corrupts it, because it violates human nature. People can no longer do what they want to do with their lives. This naturally grates against them, on them, right? And they begin to rebel and object, which inspires greater repressive force from the regime, which results in more intense rebellion, and this logic proceeds until something breaks, and it almost often breaks in the direction of human freedom, but without the proper morals foundation laid under it, it doesn't usually last very long. In any case, that's a bit of a digression. But what we're talking about here is the disposal of property.
It's authoritarianism, but it's not communism in the sense that it's not complete government ownership and control, but it's government management through policy, through regulation, and they
regulation.
pick the corporate overlords who then write the policy and tip everything, and so you're off of
the corporate overlords. In the case of the Nazis, the corporate overlords were tolerated at the grace of the government. Goering's 4-year plan, and what was it, 1937? I'm not sure. I'd have to go look that up. Assumed nearly complete control of the Nazi economy, and the leading industrialists were virtually compelled to submit to it because of things like sunk costs. Okay, they couldn't stand. I mean, they might have objected, but they would have been shot. Well, who's going to do that when they can just ride the bus and keep what they have, or live the way they want to at the grace of the government for as long as it lasts? And they saw how long it lasted. It was 12 years. The industrialists, the leading industrialists that he's talking about, are not owners. No longer are the stockholders owners in a situation like that. And we can see that process progressing today in America. I'm not ordinarily one to complain about corporations. I'm a laissez-faire anarchist. However, anybody can look at what's going on here and see regulatory capture, K Street lobbyists crawling up and down the spine of Congress all the time for generations now. And the corporations have the government wired to their interests. So they may be disposing of capital, but they're using government force to manipulate, to distort markets, which is an entirely different Austrian economics study here. Let's listen to this again.
Free market system.
The issue is that people think communism, and the only examples that exist in history are authoritarian statist communism.
Yeah, I'm going to stop there for a minute. Well, the examples that we all resort to in history are the ones that whose essential feature is the element of force. All of them have been coerced by governments, and this is not strange to Marxist theory. Everyone knows he called for for bloody revolution. Lenin ran his logic out to its extreme while he overthrew the historical dialectic or historical materialism. But that's a whole different study too, right? The political feature that unites all of these regimes is summary force. Now, this is different from the hippie communes, and this is what makes communism and all of its variants, all variants of socialism, a moral phenomenon and not merely an economic one. Capitalism, the name of which comes from socialist commenters in the 18th century, 19th century, and I don't remember who. That's something that slips my mind now. The word capitalism was confected by socialists, but its moral foundations in private property have not mitigated the misapprehensions of the word now as a purely economic phenomenon. People think that capitalism is just about economics. It's not. Capitalism is essentially a moral system with certain necessary economic implications. That's what it is. When free people can produce and trade, capitalism is what happens. They produce and raise human standards of living. We saw that in America in an unprecedented case in human history. Everyone knows this. That's what happened. Free people made the most of the Industrial Revolution and built things that kings could never have dreamed. It's when the morals of the moral foundation of the polity, right, society, are proper and people are free and they don't prey on each other and they don't use government force on each other. It's when those conditions obtain that capitalism happens. Socialism is exactly the opposite. Because of the essential element of force, people are no longer free to trade and they begin preying on each other. Now, this is necessarily given in a moral system, a political system founded on moral principles of force. People who think it's right to gang up in democracies, for instance, and force what they want to live on their neighbors. This necessarily begins to destroy morality, and it certainly destroys productivity. It reduces human standards of living. Listen to Tim.
So they associate authoritarian overt control and communism as one thing.
That's for a reason. That's its distinguishing characteristic. That's why we remember it that way. Yeah.
Whereas you can have 10 there are communes in the United States.
Yes.
Where it's like 100 people on a farm.
Yep.
And they all just do a base piece of labor and then share. And they vote people in, they vote people out. They exist. They just don't scale up because you can't have a guy from, 2 towns over coming over to me and being like, okay, now I get your fruit and you get my wood. And they're like, I don't need that. There needs to be some kind of way to do an exchange.
Hold on just a moment. Okay, there is a way to do an exchange. That's what money and freedom is about. That's what money does. Okay, it solves the problem of barter trade. It facilitates division of labor economy, specialization of labor. People can become auto transmission mechanics if they want to, or dog trainers. You can't do that in a barter economy. It's really hard to. Okay, so there is a way to do that. It doesn't require force. The problem that he's talking about is not scale. That could be scaled easily. That's what money does. The reason why places like that work to the scale they do, and there have been lots of them throughout American history, is because they're voluntary, and he'll point that out later.
It begs the question of what exactly is economics.
Here we go.
Like
now, this is going to be a digression.
From the Austrian school would say that economics is basically just the observance of subjective value judgments in the marketplace when weighed against like real world things like scarcity.
He's talking about Karl Menger's marginal revolution, the observation that economic values are indeed subjective, and that's what drives markets.
So in that sense, action that is economized of all types is technically economic. It's economic activity. Right. And money actually observed historically as a social phenomenon to solve the problem that you're talking about. It's called, in economic theory, it's called the double coincidence of wants. The whole, you have an axe, I
never heard that before, but I'll take his word for it.
Have eggs, we can't trade, so I have to go to some intermediary to trade my eggs to get your axe. And that is how gold and silver became money in the organic sense. Like it wasn't a government that dictated that these things are money. They were just a commonly valued commodity that
easily divisible, durable, portable. Okay, these things could mediate trade.
Over time became money, and so that problem was overcome by money, and then emerged the price system.
Mm-hmm. Kim Lalajo in the general chat says that is not communism, Tim. Communism is Marxism. You're talking about hippie communes.
Here we go again.
I think you exemplified perfectly my point. If we are talking about the basic economic structure, then yes, I am defining communism, and you are defining a specific historical example of one guy's writing.
Yes, we're talking about the economic structure, but as I pointed out, that's a consequence of the moral foundations. This is why this gets confused. Capitalism is not merely about economics. There is a moral foundation under it that results in the economics under discussion. It's freedom that causes capitalism. It's socialism that causes, you know what it causes, is misery and death. That's the difference. It's not about the scale of the commune. We're going to hear that again here, I believe. Hold on.
Which is not the general concept. So there's a bunch of different kinds of capitalism, right?
Wait, I want to back that up. The general concept.
Communism is Marxism. You're talking about hippie communes. I think you exemplified perfectly my point. If we are talking about the basic economic structure, then yes, I am defining communism, and you are defining a specific historical example of one guy's writing, which is not the general concept.
That's the general concept that Tim wants to discuss, but it's not the essential concept that's at stake here. The essential concept at stake here is freedom versus force. That's the difference.
So there's a bunch of different kinds of capitalism.
No. And failure to understand the moral foundation necessary to the condition known as capitalism is what causes something like this. This is just not how it works. Okay? What he's talking about really, when he says something like, when people say this, when people say there's a bunch of various degrees of capitalism, what they're really talking about is a continuum of degrees of force once the principle of force in markets has been stipulated. Once you give up the idea, once you submit to the idea that force in markets and force in life in general, because markets are life, Once you stipulate to that idea, then you can go on to discuss things like degrees of capitalism. Well, what we're talking about is degrees of control over the disposal of private property and how little or how much the state is going to allow people to dispose of what they own. That's what that means. Let's listen.
There's capitalism, like, to varying degrees. When you move left and right on the political compass, you get varying degrees of regulation versus freedom, laissez-faire capitalism. But there's an upward motion as well. So, like, in the middle, you have a basic thing, like the libertarian middle would kind of be like, we live on a farm, we all agree there's a chore rotation.
Back to the farm, okay, the small commune.
However, if somebody wants a specific task done, then we trade for it. If you go all the way to the hippie commune left, everyone's just like, we agree you can use whatever you want. I don't think that scales properly. If you go all the way to the right, then everyone's just trading and exchanging value, which tends to work very, very well in the long run.
He didn't explain why, really, he didn't explain why the left, the communal polity doesn't work. It's not because it doesn't scale. It's not because an arrangement like that could scale to the size of a nation as long as everyone agreed to it. Okay? The true test of it is the first dissenter who decides, well, I don't want to live this way. Now, if you're talking about a political system that actually constitutes an entire country, now you're talking about throwing a man out of his own land, dictating the way he lives. If he doesn't join the herd, he can no longer be, what, a Soviet, a Nazi, an American? That's the test. Anything can scale. Any of these systems, any communal system can scale, if that's the essential element, as long as everyone agrees. But that's not the essential element. The essential element of communism, as we've known it since 1917, or since earlier attempts, 1848, right? 1789, communism, we refer to it in the terms that we do precisely because it's been so bloody in its application of force. This is different from the communal farm.
That doesn't mean that all forms of communal living are authoritarian.
That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, but now we're running into a distinction in applications of the word. Communal living is not what we're talking about when we're talking about communism. Let's get that straight. Okay, what Tim is benignly describing as communal living is not what we're talking about when we're talking about communism.
There are communes in the United States. There's one example I was reading about. 100 people live there. 100
They're
people.
Old.
And it is a commune. And they have like a board that votes on when people can come in and go out, and they all agree the system works and they all get along. But it's usually like people come and live there for a year or two and then leave. So
that's right, because they're free to.
But see, what happens is people read about history, and there's one historical example of communism because it never works at scale, and it's statist authoritarianism.
That's why it never works at all. It wouldn't work in your neighborhood if somebody came along and told you that you were going to live under communist rules and pointed a gun at you. It's not because it doesn't scale. It's because of force. And that's why we refer to those regimes as the way we do. And it's not just a single example. And Tim knows this, okay? It's not just the Soviet Union. It's, you could run the gamut. And you'd have to, on principle, include the Nazis.
But don't confuse an authoritarian system with the economic concept of communal function, like communal economics.
I don't, Tim. I don't. That's exactly my problem with what I heard this evening and why I'm pointing this out. The difference between what he's talking about in in communal living and communist regimes is the element of force. That can a communal arrangement of the sort that he's talking about could scale easy. Communism can't. It never will. And that's why. And that's why this discussion is a little confused, and it keeps enduring as long as this is not straightened out. Good luck.